Jack.
Levi.
The book club from hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, a crack team of elite cleaners, guaranteed to appear anywhere in the world within 30 minutes to clean even the most stubborn stains from your beloved fursuit. This week's episode is not on a single book, but is rather on our impressions of the furry community, as gleaned from our explorations of various online resources such as WikiFur and the International Anthropomorphic Research Project. We've enjoyed some of the output of the furry community previously on this podcast, with our episode on Jack by David Hopkins, but wanted to learn more about the world of furdom. Alright, I don't change the following section of shilling much between episodes, so if you're a regular listener, feel free to recite along with me, preferably out loud. If you like what we're doing with this podcast and want to support us, we have a Patreon account, the link to which is in the show notes. People on Patreon can access the notes I make for episodes, so if you want more information on the books or manifestos we've covered, you can find more there. Additionally, I've published a novel called Tower, which you can find on Amazon or on Apple Books, links also in the show notes. One final thing, Levi and I are taking a break next week. As such, there won't be an episode next week. Normal weekly episodes will resume after that. So, if you want to be able to pick your fursuits from your mersuits, your funny animals from your furry comics, and your con crud from your con funk, then listen on. Enjoy.
It's big in Russia, is it?
Because I guess, well, there are a lot of Russian speakers, so that'll be part of it. So on WikiFur, the most by far articles are in English, then Russian. Let's have a look at the various languages on WikiFur. But yeah, there are a bunch of Russians, so 700. Yeah, okay, so 22,600 plus articles in English, 6,100 in Russian, then 1,700 in Italian, only 750 in Spanish, only 470 in Mandarin Chinese, 150 in Czech.
They were punching way above their weight.
What the fuck? Considering that there are like, I don't know, probably 11 million Czech speakers.
And actually half of those articles are written by Jack.
Yeah, they're actually all by me. Oh, good. So 170 in Polish. So the Polish are more degenerate than the Czechs, although there are many more Polish speakers than Czech speakers. So
proportionally less degenerate, but in absolute terms, more degenerate.
30 in Danish, 230 in Swedish. So the Swedish are much more furry than the Danes. 10 in Tagalog. Yeah, it is funny that it's okay. So it's very English dominant, but there are a lot of Russian articles. Second largest language on WikiFur, Russians. So we got around to talking about this because Levi said that the Russians and the Chinese will point to furdom as evidence of the West's decline, but actually the Russians
are going down as well.
So, in terms of structuring this episode, this is mostly just going to be our impressions of what WikiFur and various furry resources on the internet are. So, neither of us are furries. Neither of us have had much contact with the furry community beyond reading Jack, which is a furry webcomic.
I have one friend who used to be a furry. Might really? Still be a furry. I'm not sure.
Say their whole name. This is not an exhaustive, definitive guide to what furdom is. This is the impression of it from two outsiders.
Yeah, outsiders trying to get a little bit more understanding than just what we came across in Jack. Which I think maybe a lot of furries would not consider Jack the best first impression that one could have of their community.
Yes and no. So I'm more sympathetic to furries having read Jack, or at least a large portion of Jack, and then looked around WikiFur and the various repositories of furry knowledge on the internet. So I will acknowledge my ignorant impressions of what furries were before our extensive research on them was basically fursuiters, sex maniacs, pornographers, Which, granted, there is a strong element of porn in the furry community.
It's a very sexual community.
It's a highly sexual community, but there is more to it than that. And I'm also just sympathetic, really, to any group of probably quite strange people finding common interests and finding some sense of community in that. Particularly the conventions. So some of the conventions do sound kind of fucked. Like, I think it was Rainforest. I think it was Rainforest 2015 is the notorious one.
Completely degenerate.
Where it just turned into Heart of Darkness. But on the whole, the conventions actually sound like something that I probably wouldn't get much out of, but a place where people with niche interests can get together and engage in those interests in a place where they won't feel like they're going to be judged. They don't have to be defensive. They can engage with something that they find meaningful with other people. And that sounds really, really nice. That sounds very positive. One thing that I still haven't been able to get over, though, is particularly when I see furry porn and just doing any sort of research for this episode, you just run into porn so easily. I feel this visceral disgust when I see like big meaty furry dicks.
It's so weird. They put fur all the way up the dick.
When I see like detailed humanoid vaginas in like a rabbit person, I just find
it's really off-putting, isn't it?
It's really disgusting. So I'm sure many people listening have some idea of what furries are, but maybe we can talk a bit about what they are from the perspective of the furry community, because at least from the outside, the most visible things of furdom are really the most visible, and those people tend to be the fursuiters. Those are the people that I initially equated with all furries. Fursuiters are people who dress up in these anthropomorphic animal costumes.
They're the most visible subset of furries.
Yeah, and they're very visible. So in a park near which I used to live, there were regular fur meets.
Yiffing.
No, they weren't yiffing, fortunately. Man, some of the terminology too. They've got their own lexicon. Some of which is used to describe quite benign things. Much of which is used to describe sex acts. We'll talk about sex within the furry community later, but it is a really prominent part of it. There is so much porn. There's so much mind-bending porn. So furries are basically, they're people. It's a community of people who like anthropomorphic animals, or like animals portrayed in media that have some sort of human characteristics. And these grew out of, I think, people appreciating funny animals, which were animals with some sort of human characteristics like intelligence or the ability to speak. For example, Disney cartoons like Mickey Mouse, or Looney Tunes with Bugs Bunny, or The Lion King is also Disney, but The Lion King. People who appreciated animals depicted in media, particularly in drawn media. This started becoming more identifiably what we would call furry now, as sort of I think in the late 80s or in the 80s and 90s, when instead of just having character or funny animal characters that were animals but could speak or something like that, these animals became more anthropomorphic. And the furry community there are many different definitions of it. It's quite a fractious community, and we can go into that. But broadly speaking, at least to my mind, the defining characteristic seems to be that they like artistic depictions of anthropomorphic animals. And that's the core. From that, you can get people who are much more into it, who take it more as a lifestyle.
A lifestyle.
Who are the extreme, the people who will fursuit, or the people who, in everyday conversation, apparently, there were some people on not WikiFur, I think, but on other furry sites complaining that some people give the fandom a bad name by like barking at the supermarket. There were also a lot of accusations that some people cross over into being otherkin, and that also gives the furry community a bad name.
Yeah, there's definitely some tension between those two communities.
Yeah, and as we noted in the otherkin episode, many otherkin sources we read really, really wanted to make sure that the reader knew that they weren't furries. And many furries really want you to know that they're not otherkin. The otherkin are weird, but we're not them. We're furries, not otherkin, not Therians. It's an interesting experience looking through these subcultures where there are real intersections or real areas of overlap, and it seems that it's particularly where there are those small areas of overlap. The two communities make a really concerted effort to distinguish themselves from each other, and will have many members who really want you to know that they are not of that other community. What were your impressions of the central tenets of being furry?
Yeah, I think you pretty much summarized it in terms of the artistic, cultural, and cultural production of anthropomorphic animal sort of. Yeah, and like you, I thought that it was that the fursuit was like a really big part of it, and I guess to some degree it is, but it's not. It's not the only way of engaging in the community. But I think it is important to maybe not all furries have a fursona. Because I guess there's a distinction between having a fursona and having a fursuit. I suppose in principle you could have a fursona but never have a fursuit for it.
Actually, yeah. Say what a fursona is, because that's really important. Yeah. So I guess it's, if you think about concentric circles of being a furry, probably the biggest is the appreciation of artistic depictions of anthropomorphic animals.
Yeah. So I'll just read the,
and then it's like, and then maybe the next circle within that might be having a fursona, because that's really common. I don't think it's universal, but it's common.
I'll read the WikiFur intro to it. A fursona is a fur speech portmanteau derived from the terms furry and persona that refers to a character, persona, alter ego, avatar, or identity assumed by a person or player normally associated with the furry fandom. The fursona itself consists of a name, usually fictitious, and a species, as well as any distinctive colors, markings, and body features. The person might actually commission an artist. So there's people who specialize in essentially depicting furries. And so if I wanted to create, I don't know, like Levi the cat boy, although I suppose Catboy Levi would need a different...
Shout out to Count Flop. Already supplied the art for that.
Would need a slightly different name rather than using my human name. But the Catboy Fursona version of Levi, I could get commissioned to be like sexy and buff and have big cartoonish eyes and all that sort of stuff. But I think one important part of it is that they actually develop a personality for this fursona. Yeah. So if you watch some of the furries on YouTube, such as Majira Strawberry, who is a YouTuber, they have their fursuit and they have their fursona. And when they're in their fursuit, they are, I suppose, embodying or enacting their fursona.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's a big element of role play as well.
Yeah, and that extends to other areas like mucks, where so a muck it's basically like a text-based role playing game, and various mucks have different rules. The extent to which someone needs to be in character all the time, the extent to which people can break character. There are a lot of different suggestions as to what MUC stands for, like multi-user created kingdom, multi-user chat kingdom, multi-user construction kit. But basically, this is another avenue within which people roleplay within the context of being a furry. They roleplay as their fursona. I think people can also have multiple fursonas too. I'm pretty sure I've seen a few cases in which people had several.
Oh yeah, you can definitely have multiple personas. So I guess
and this fursona, so it's like at its core, it's this idea of a furry character, including its appearance, its species, its personality that exists in your head that you can role play as, and then you can have art commissioned of it. And again, this speaks to the centrality of particularly visual art to the furry community. So there are a lot of furry artists who will do commissions. And then I guess a further level of instantiating this fursona is the fursuit.
Yes.
So you can have your drawings of your fursona, and then you can actually get a fursuit made or make a fursuit yourself, which represents this fursona. So people can go really deep on instantiating this fursona in different media.
And an important point is that at any or a distinction between what they're doing with fursonas and fursuits and otherkin is that one, these are anthropocentric or anthropomorphized animals.
Yeah.
And whereas otherkin are literally saying, no, like I am a dog. Like in my identity, my species identity is that of a dog, and they're not trying to anthropomorphize it. And whereas the furries are a lot more interested in this artistic form of fusing together animal features with human features to create like their universe of different characters and whatnot.
Yeah, definitely in the main, or at least most furries don't seem to identify as the animal that their fursona is.
And I'm sure there is a small subset that has an overlap. Yeah.
You do get overlap. So I've definitely seen some people who are furries and otherkin.
But for the most part, the
most part, the two are distinct. Yeah.
But one really interesting point that Jack made, I think, on the Jack episode was how impressive the cultural, artistic, and literary output of the furry community is.
It's just prolific. There's so much. Again,
really deeply inspired people.
I find the art style, how it's the combination of oftentimes has a naive childishness to it and is oftentimes very sexually suggestive. I find it so unsettling. I do not enjoy the vast majority of furry artistic output. But despite that, I can acknowledge that it is an impressively generative community. It's just not one that I can instinctually enjoy.
I wonder why they've what would you say, infantilized that
it does. There is a lot of childishness to it, and quite so. It's hard to say this without it sounding pejorative. I really don't mean this pejoratively, but there does seem to be a very fundamental childishness to a lot of facets of furry expression. So in the drawings themselves, so these anthropomorphic creatures will oftentimes have really big googly eyes. They'll be quite cute looking. They seem very much modeled on sort of children's cartoons or have quite childish features. Additionally, dialogue within furry comics is oftentimes quite childish. It feels like 8-year-olds interacting, including sort of maybe not 8-year-olds, like I don't know, a 12-year-old's concept of what sex is. It's like, oh, when two people love each other very much, they lie down in bed and do something. It's this combination of that combined with like graphic depictions of the sex act.
Yeah. And at times extremely strange sex as well.
Well, yeah, you get stuff like vor. On Wikifur, there's a page on vor, which for the uninitiated, prepare to be initiated. Vor is it's porn based on being sexually excited by being eaten by another creature. But there are particular subcategories of it. So there's, for example, cockvore, which it's essentially being drawn up through the urethra of a large penis. And there are various things that can happen.
So weird. That is so strange.
So you can be drawn into the testicles and turned into cum and then like ejaculated back out. That's one way. Apparently you can be drawn into the bladder and turned into piss and then pissed out. Any opening can be a vessel for vor. There can be anal vor, cock vor. It's the sky's the limit.
I'm not entirely sure my life is better for learning that, Jack. But thank you for the information.
The varieties of human experience are broad, perplexing, and beautiful. Yeah, so we can talk more about the pornographic aspect of it later.
Yeah, don't worry. We've got the Yiffy Guide to Safer Sex coming up.
Yeah, I unfortunately did have a look at that. It's. I keep saying it. It's just the furry porn I find so deeply repulsive. Hey, if someone's into it, fucking fine, go for it. I won't. I was going to say I won't yuck your yum, but actually
I will.
That's a complete lie. Like, I'll fucking yuck so many yums.
But I won't stop you yums, from doing front,
it. Left, right, and center. Like, you can do it. I just am
gonna laugh at you.
Look down on you a bit for it. No,
just drop all pretenses of like being tolerant. Just say, I'm just going to bully you if you do this.
I'm not going to bully someone over it, but at the same time, I'm not going to pretend that I find it just not repulsive. Human sexuality is very odd, though. Like, it's just kind of this black box. It's just, everyone's got their thing, and some people's thing is cockvore.
Is furry cockvore.
I just don't pretend to understand.
Furry cockvore. How the fuck could you imagine like the post-nut shame of somebody jacking off to furry cockvore? Like, surely after you're done and you're cleaning yourself up, you just look at yourself and just go, what?
It's like, I can't fucking believe I just did that. Oh no. You open up your history tab if you're not in incognito mode and just feel such a deep, cavernous, black sense of shame.
You just burn your computer.
Yeah. You go full Ted Kaczynski and forswear technology. No, it was a mistake. I'm done.
Because furry cockvore didn't exist before the internet, right? Like, that is definitely something that is a new innovation because of the
I'm going to go out on a limb and say furry cockvore is it's the product of intense desensitization and of communal desensitization. This is not the sort of thing that just appears
spontaneously
spontaneously in an individual. This is a sort of thing that it's the result of watching a lot of porn from a young age and getting very desensitized through that, then getting into furry, then getting into furry porn, and then the process of desensitization taking place along the axis of furry porn, where you're not physically limited by what two performers or more performers can do. You're limited only by your imagination and your desensitization to sexual imagery.
I genuinely wonder what the journey of somebody, like if you took like an image, like a snapshot along their life of the porn that they consumed up to the point that they started consuming furry cockvore.
The thing is, it's
like, did they start off weird, or did they start off like real vanilla with just run of the mill?
I'm sure
stuff.
I'm certain that they started off really vanilla, because it's like anyone who's of an age where they've been able to have their idea of sex warped by early exposure to porn. It's that no one starts off, even if you're not talking about like furry stuff, no one starts off looking at like anal gape, turbo gangbangs, double penetration, stuff like that. People start off by just looking at
straight
normal
to
stuff.
the anal gape.
Like, people start off by like, I don't know, let me see some titties. And then when they're a little bit desensitized, they'll move on to like, okay, let me have two people just normally having sex. The hedonic treadmill, the hedonic ratchet of porn it's fairly predictable, I would anticipate, of where people start, where people go. And I suppose furry cockvore is a branch of that. So you need to have you need to be into furries.
This is
initially. You need to have some sort of predilection for drawn porn, for like cartoon pornography. But once you're there, if you just keep following desensitization
and artistic creation
and commissioning it, I guess the ultimate stage is commissioning furry cockvore.
Well, like, now okay, that
the stuff on offer is not specifically tickling that itch.
Well, that's why we've got generative AI now. Now everybody can have access to this.
Holy shit! I hadn't even considered that.
It truly is the end of the world. Jack's just lost his mind. He's like, I can have so much furry cockvore now.
Only getting hit by a comet can save us at this stage.
See, I normally am a big fan of David Deutsch and the Beginning of Infinity, and I've spoken a number of times, except this is also one of the consequences of infinite progress.
Yeah.
We can have like everybody starts out just
limitless variety of furry cockvore. But actually, this is interesting because the dynamics of I knew that I said we'd be talking about porn after talking about some of many of the more positive aspects of furdom, but I guess we're talking about porn now. But so before, the dynamics of porn were much more. Well, okay, it's always going to be according to supply and demand. It's just, I guess, when the cost of demand gets so incredibly low, there's not going to be an appreciable correspondence between the number of people who want to see some sort of porn and the amount of that porn in existence. It's going to now much... There was always the dynamic of, okay, the number of people who want to see some sort of porn, and that would affect how much of it there is. There would also be the intensity of desire. So someone might be into a less commonly appreciated form of porn, but because of their passion for it, or the passion of a small group of people into it,
passionate about,
they would
very cockvore.
They'd be willing to pay more money for it, which is, the invisible hand will be grasping towards making more of that particular type of porn.
The invisible hand at work.
The invisible hand. This is what Adam Smith wrote about. He was writing about the dynamics of furry cockvore versus technology and demand. But with generative AI, the cost of producing any form of furry porn, or just porn in general, goes through the floor. So long as you're willing to, particularly the hands I find in generative AI, hands always look pretty funky.
Yeah. Or any faces over of arms.
That itself, I imagine, will become its own sub fetish.
Yeah, no doubt.
AI hooked up in the 2043 Goon Cave, looking at pictures of 2023 AI generated porn. Just give you that really crispy 2023 fucked up face and hand stuff.
I really like
the only thing that can get me off.
My pornographic depictions of Donald J. Trump being eaten by a giant furry cock to have weird fingers.
Yeah, I want everything to be strangely globular, like a lot of the AI generated pictures in current year are.
It's very strange. Yeah, so that essentially drops the cost of generating weird new porn genres towards zero. As long as you can accept that for a little while, the quality is going to be a bit off.
The number of weird niche porn depictions they'll probably grow massively. Also because you have an existing body of porn consumers who are catered to. Like, most porn consumers will be catered to by most porn, because most porn is for them. So you expect the rate of growth of niche stuff to far exceed that of more vanilla stuff. So we might live through a period where there is parity between more vanilla stuff and furry cockvore.
Yeah. Well, who would have thought that the Kali Yuga would be characterized by furry cock porn? Cockvore.
Yeah, just washed away on the endless tides of spooge.
Furry spooge. Just like dried up fursuits covered in spooge after they've been spat out by a giant cock.
With fursuits, though, one thing that it was predictable, I just hadn't thought about it so much, is that they are expensive.
Yeah,
that
really
people feel a real sense of ownership over them because it's an external depiction of their fursona, and as such, they're very protective of them. I imagine most fursuiters wouldn't want people coming all over their fursuit; that they want it kept safe. So when I was looking at convention etiquette, for example, we can talk about
convention etiquette is like do not come on one another without permission.
No, it's even things like be really careful with food and drink around fursuiters because if you stain the fursuit, that's like it's part of someone's identity.
I think my friend who is into or was said that his fursuit cost like more than $2,000.
Yeah,
and I imagine that might be a cheap one.
Okay. We've gotten detoured talking about fucked up porn. Let's talk about the aspects of the furry community that are
they've probably
healthier,
driven a lot of innovation in costume design and creation because they also want to wear those things for like entire day, like multi-day stretches. So there's probably been a lot of innovation around ventilation and that sort of stuff in those suits.
Yeah, people really suffer for their art too at conventions because. Again, like this should have been obvious, or would have been if I'd thought about it more, but they're not comfortable to wear. So there are different types of fursuits you can wear. Like you can get partial suits where maybe you'll have the mask, like the headpiece, and you'll have gloves that are like paws and shoes that are like paws as well. And otherwise you're wearing normal clothes. Those can be quite hard to see in, and your head is going to be pretty sweaty because you've got a big furry helmet on, basically. And oftentimes at a convention, for example, they'll have a minder, particularly if they're less, I guess they have less practice navigating 3D space with that fursuit head on. But then you can get full suits, so you're totally costumed as your fursona, and those get hot apparently. So I was reading that. Some people have little electric fans within the fursuit for airflow.
That's
but
crazy.
Even then, it's like you get super sweaty, you get super hot. It is uncomfortable. They have lounges at many conventions where fursuiters can go. Oftentimes, only fursuiters are allowed there. They can go in, sit down, take off their mask, and have a breather.
People really do suffer for their art.
Yeah, and some of them, and that's right, some of them even have drying racks for the suits because you get so sweaty in them.
That's crazy.
And so things like that make me, like, I feel much more sympathetic because this obviously means so much to people that they're willing to go through what is probably a very uncomfortable experience to fursuit at a convention and to fursuit in a place where their fursuit will be appreciated by people. Because at a convention, you're around other people who are into the same niche stuff as you.
Yeah.
And people are going to be excited at seeing someone expressing their fursona in this physical way.
They're definitely committed. Yeah.
Oh, they're very
creative, very committed.
It's why, despite all my misgivings, particularly about the porn, and that confluence of being very sexualized and quite childish, despite those misgivings, I still feel fairly sympathetically towards the furry community because they're very committed, they're very creative, and work out all of these ways to express their appreciation of anthropomorphic animals.
Yeah.
It's a very strange phenomenon, but very committed, very generative.
Yeah, it's an interesting community. I think that it's good that they exist because now we can make content about them. I don't foresee myself ever attending a furry convention.
No,
unless I was paid to or something, but I'd just sell out straight away. Yeah, give me the fursuit, whatever. Bring on the giant cockpaw.
Yeah, look, we would need to be for a book club from hell YouTube special. Need people to buy us a pass to a furry convention. Yeah, one thing which is sort of expected about a community like furries is that very, very quickly on reading their descriptions of themselves, I detected there's a lot of defensiveness in the furry community. There's a great deal of defensiveness saying like, okay, we're not all about porn. We're not all fursuiters. And particularly comparing themselves to other fandoms, like to Star Trek fans or to Star Wars fans or to sci-fi fans, things like that. Comparing themselves to these people and saying, look, we're not qualitatively different from these people. And
fair enough.
For example, a Star Wars fan isn't going to attract nearly the same opprobrium as a furry.
It's just more mainstream, I suppose.
Mainstream, I will say though, so furries, at least the sources I read, mostly WikiFur, point out repeatedly that being a furry is not all about porn. It's not all about sex. And that is true. There is a lot that isn't porn and isn't sex. But unlike the Star Wars fandom, you're never far away from porn.
What?
Like,
no, there's heaps of Star Wars porn.
Yeah.
There's heaps of really weird Star Wars porn.
I am certain that Star Wars porn exists. I am also certain that it's not perhaps the largest source of financial gain in the Star Wars community. There's so much furry porn. It seems that furry artists will often make most of their money from porn. That's just where the money is. And so that's what they make. I agree. There's a lot of the furry community that isn't pornographic, but there's so much porn. It is so a part of the furry community. It's a fundamental part, I'd say. It's so present.
Yeah, I think I think
and
that's
a major distinction between it and other fandoms.
Yeah, but I understand where they're coming from with it. If they'd be like, why are we so much worse than say Comic-Con? Like all these people in Comic-Con are dressing up and spending thousands and thousands of dollars on their pretending to be a fictional character. At least with furries, like they're creating their own characters rather than embodying other people's characters. So it's like, and actually that was one of the interesting points that I can't remember which article it was saying, but it was saying that unlike other communities, like say fan fiction or Comic-Con, that have say a small number of large organizations pushing, like essentially doing marketing and trying to grow the community, so to speak, or the fan base. Furries are essentially an entirely user, like ground up grassroots movement, for lack of a better word, where it's essentially all user generated. And there might be anthropocentric animals in say Disney films, but Disney isn't catering to the furry community. Like that is just I'm sure they don't really give a shit about the furry community. So I thought that was really interesting that it's an entirely grassroots subculture.
Yeah, and one that you're right. So initially it wasn't catered to. It was sort of people who liked various depictions of animals in media gathering together. It seems a lot of the initial movement was taking place at science fiction conventions in sort of the 70s and 80s. And people slowly began to... So people who were interested in funny animals or depictions of animals in media would gather together at those conventions, and slowly they would begin to have hotel room parties. And eventually those would be declared as being for people who liked anthropomorphic animals or furries. So you had that grassroots social aspect from very, very early on, and then the internet came along, because it's one thing that, it's a niche interest, and so getting together at a hotel room at a science fiction conference isn't all that scalable. That it's still going to be fairly small. But when you get the internet, where you can have a lot of people gathering together on various, I think it was like Usenet, it was really, really big there before the World Wide Web. You can get people gathering together there, and that really, really threw rocket fuel onto the furry fire. It really, really got it going. And like we said earlier, you have role playing spaces like Mux. They use Second Life quite a lot, which makes sense. So there are virtual spaces too, where people can express their fursonas. And you also got furry conventions. Furry conventions are one of the most interesting aspects of the furry fandom, I think, because I haven't been to a Comic-Con, I haven't been to a science fiction convention, I haven't been to any conventions, but the furry ones do sound particularly intense in their expression of their love for the community or their dedication to the community, because you
particularly enthusiastic.
Yeah, very enthusiastic. So yeah, at Comic-Con, like, you'll get cosplayers and things, which I guess are analogous to fursuiters. One thing that is impressive about the furry conventions is I think it's called the Dealer's Den and the Artist's Alley.
Oh, what's that? I didn't see that.
So they're these places where mostly, I think, artists will congregate and sell things that they've already drawn or take commissions. I think you have people there who also sell fursuits or fursuit components. It's it's like this small economy dedicated to stuff that furries like. And I thought, like, that's cool. It's, you go somewhere, you can get artwork commissioned. Like, we were talking about furry cockvore before. It could be that,
or it could just be a rendering.
You could look at a human. You can look at a person in the face and describe to them the, like, anal vor that you really want them to draw. No, I think mostly they will draw your fursona.
Yeah,
I think the passes for conventions, sometimes people will have custom versions of those commissioned with their fursona on them, things like that. That's cool. With the conventions too, I feel like the conventions are part of what give furries a bad name relative to other fandoms, and also unfairly, because there have been conventions where it's just been a complete disaster. So people behaving appallingly badly.
Rainforest 2017.
I think, Rainforest was the one
that's the most
heard
famous one.
A fair bit about. Yeah, so people.
I think there's been some other bad ones.
I think it was to a Hilton hotel, and just like taking drugs, fucking each other, shitting in public places, smashing stuff, like doing shits in the hot tub, just behaving appallingly. And that sort of stuff, unfairly, just gives the entire fandom a bad name.
I wonder why they, like, what the hell got into their heads when they did that? It's just complete menace.
So I'm guessing that the act of fursuiting, or the act of being anonymous, or being able to take on a personality other than your own, and not being as easily identifiable as the day-to-day you, does contribute to those dynamics. I expect that has a large role to play in it. It's also, though, it's the license of being away from home, being in a hotel, being around people who are into the same sorts of things as you, and you can be open about your interests around them. So there's that element of disinhibition, plus the disinhibition of fursuiting for those people who are fursuiting. And also that at least some conventions have there's the assumption that people are going to party there. So this is not all conventions, not even with the conventions where there is partying, it's not the entire convention, but there's the expectation that at least at some conventions, if you want a party, there will be like hotel room parties or maybe something even more official or organized available. So I think those things go some way to explaining why there have been certain conventions where people have behaved terribly. But I also want to say, like, these are aberrations. Most furry conventions are not full Heart of Darkness.
Yeah.
Just breakdown of social order.
Yeah, it's just the one or two that got a lot of coverage on.
Got a lot of press.
Yeah, especially on social media. Which is a shame.
Social media.
It is one of those situations where a few bad apples spoiled the entire bunch.
I think one of the other things that has given the furry community, at least publicly, a worse image was there was some CSI episode that just keeps getting referenced in various things that I read. Where I didn't watch the CSI episode, but I'm assuming it depicts furries in a really bad light. So for a large number of people,
episode's called
their entire interaction
Loathing.
with the furry community will have been some CSI episode that I assume was like just depicting them as complete perverts, sex pests.
It's called Fur and Loathing on CSI Miami. Fur and Loathing is the episode.
Yeah,
I bet you they hated that episode when it came out. I bet you the furry community freaked out about it.
I think they still do hate it though, because when I was reading for this episode, multiple times I heard it brought up, this particular CSI episode. I think also, so cosplaying is one thing. With fursuits, I find them very unsettling.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'm alone in finding them unsettling to look at. And I anticipate that also is part of what gives the community a worse image. Because as we said at the beginning of this episode, that's the really visible part of the community, or a very visible part of the community. Also, for those who grew up in the internet age or grew up with the internet, I really think the pervasiveness of furry porn jaundices a lot of attitudes to furdom. Because it's, I just feel like if you were born after like 1990 or even before that, like, you've come into contact with furry porn.
Yeah, and anime tentacle porn.
And if you haven't been desensitized or haven't started along that process, or actually no, it's just the desensitization. If you're not desensitized to it, your initial response to seeing like two anthropomorphic turtles fucking is disgust. And I expect that also goes quite a way to explaining why furries are a particular fandom who have a much worse public image than, say, Trekkies. There have been efforts within the furry community to improve the public image, and I find this really interesting. There was a group called the Burned Furs who didn't last for very long. They didn't. Let's have a look. Yeah. Existed mostly between 1998 and 2001. They were restarted by different people in 2005, but I don't think they're nearly as prominent as they were in that initial period. These were furries themselves who felt that the furry community was harboring sort of sexual perverts and things like that, and that was giving the entire community a bad name. So you had furries who just liked pictures of anthropomorphic animals doing stuff, and they were being unfairly maligned by a public whose idea of furdom was informed by people who were into different sexual fetishes. So things like zoophilia, for example, is apparently still in the furry community a real point of contention. But the Burned Furs saw a lot of the more unusual sexual fetishes within the furry community as a real source of weakness and really tried to get rid of it. But the furry community on the whole reacted very badly to that, and the project was unsuccessful. I'm willing to bet a lot of money that the volume of furry fetish porn being produced now is far in excess of that which was produced between
I wonder
1998 and
what
2001.
did you read much about the furries community, different stances on zoophilia? I actually didn't come across that.
I read a bit.
Because that's a really good point. I hadn't even considered that.
It's meant to be a way that will easily get a furry, or most furries, very upset and defensive is if you accuse them of being zoophiles.
Yeah.
Which is fair enough. I wouldn't appreciate being called that. So I think there's a minority who think that zoophilia is fine. It's totally cool. Most furries, so okay, the furry community,
are not going to.
Many furries are also really interested in animal rights, or like in not being cruel to animals, in animal welfare, which makes sense.
Yeah.
Many of them view zoophilia as animal abuse, which
is fair
also
enough.
Fair enough. So the furry community is very, very loath to yuck someone's yum. However, I'm quite happy to yuck the yum of wanting to have sex with a non-human animal. So not only do I have a problem with it from the perspective of animal cruelty, I also think if you want to have sex with like a dog or something, you've got some serious fucking problems.
That is one of the stranger things that humans do, isn't it?
Yeah. It's very strange.
Yeah, I guess some yums deserve to be yucked, don't they?
Yeah, I don't think there's a blanket no yucking yums. I think some yums are definitely yuckable. No, so the discussion of zoophilia mostly it's mostly frowned on. That said, like it's an entire community which has a significant part of it dedicated to depicting sex acts between anthropomorphic animals, but they're still animals. They're still pretty animalistic.
They still have tails and paws and animal ears.
I think it's also there's a distinction between people who say, okay, you can depict zoophilia and that's okay. And then like you have the small minority, the hardcore people who say, no, zoophilia in real life is okay as well.
Man, I just don't know how I would manage a conversation with somebody. Like if I actually met somebody who is holding either one of those positions, honestly, I guess I could make the concession to the person who's talking about depiction as I could say like, well, I guess no animals are actually being hurt, but it's still pretty weird.
Yeah. I would say, yeah, with that, it's like, it's weird. And it's weird and like not weird in necessarily a cool way. It's weird in a like keep that to yourself. Don't tell anyone. And like you're not hurting anyone, fine. Cool just don't tell this to other people and expect them to be understanding.
Yeah, and definitely like keep it constrained to
the second dimension.
Depictions, animated depictions. Don't, like have a hard boundary for yourself. I just think that if you are jacking off to like animated depictions of zoophilic porn or like furry cock vor or whatever, you should really like, I don't know, just reflect on how you got into that position.
Yeah,
like what's going on?
This is more broadly a problem with porn, in that I just don't think much porn consumption, if any porn consumption at all, is good for you. Like that level of sexual stimulation of being able to view, like, in one session, at how many different people having sex, that level of sexual stimulation has all sorts of downsides. Like it has for guys, like you have people in their mid-20s with erectile dysfunction from watching tons of porn, and like that just shouldn't be happening. You should be fine at that age. Like through your 30s and 40s too. Like everything should be working.
Really, you should be hard until the day you die. 120, just have a raging hard on.
Raging boner. Yeah, so there's that. There's also the desensitization, which we talked about earlier, where like it's a hedonic treadmill. Like you're just looking for something that's going to give you that squirt of dopamine, and you adapt to a high level of sexual stimulation. And so you look for progressively more extreme or just novel forms of porn. And I anticipate that's where this sort of stuff comes from. It's like maybe, humans, the human experience is broad and varied. However, I anticipate most people who are into, like we keep talking about furry cockfor as the canonical example of pornographic excess. There are so few people who just de novo want furry cockfor. That's the sort of thing that comes from just sexual overstimulation or sexual overstimulation purely from a visual perspective. So sex shorn of any sort of love or intimacy. It's a purely mechanical, animal, visual aspect of sex. So a lot of this weird stuff, I think, is actually just a consequence of porn more broadly.
Yeah.
I think people should be allowed to watch it, but at the same time, people should not be kidding themselves that it is remotely good for them.
You know what's really interesting, though, is like I've met a lot of people in my life. You've probably, like, if you've lived in a major city and gone to a decent-sized university, by the time you're 30, say, you've probably met thousands of people, maybe 3,000 people, something like that. Not one of them stands out to me as the sort of person who would be into furry cockfor or zoophilic porn. And yet somewhere out there in the world, there's like somebody filming themselves getting fucked by like a Great Dane or something. and I don't know where these people are. The world is just so big.
Yeah. And which
but
it is
they can
important
publish
to say,
it to the internet.
Most furries as well will hear about that person filming themselves having sex with a Great Dane and say, like, no, that's fucked up. That's not us. And that's fair enough. Like, most furries are not on board with that in any way.
Furry's probably pissed off at this episode just because we've spoken about this so much in relation to that.
We've spoken about it so much, but also so part of it is, this is the perspective of furdom from people who are not furries, who are not experienced in this community. And it is important to acknowledge that a lot of the exterior appearance of furdom is pornographic. Because that just is a lot of what is produced. Very generative community. A lot of the generation is pornographic.
Holy shit. You know what I just found? Slight change of topic. Furscience.com. So we were reading
that is a really interesting site.
They actually have published in 2017, they took 5 years of Fur Science and turned it into a free PDF, which I'll send to you now. We could have read this for this episode, but we didn't. It's probably pretty boring. I mean, a lot of it's about like demographics and stuff.
No, that's really interesting. Let's talk about that.
Okay, so like age of furries. Okay, let's see. So they,
broadly speaking, though, let's just say what furscience.com.
Oh yeah, so first a bit.
It's the public face of the International Anthropomorphic. Here we go. The International Anthropomorphic Research Project, which is a project that studies furries and the furry fandom. And then compiles the results.
And they have a lot of papers.
And they've got a lot of data. I did look at this. If you want a view of furdom that's not steeped in a lot of furry terminology and doesn't carry with it doesn't demand a lot of assumed knowledge to understand, this is a really, really good place to go to. I can put the link to it in the show notes, actually.
It's jam-packed full of information. So,
because it is at once it seems very authentically furry. A lot of the researchers involved are themselves furries, and not just furries, but fursuiters.
Whoa!
But also, it's putting their best paw forward. It's a really good resource.
So let's go over some of these things. Some interesting facts. So they've got age of furries, but they start the cutoff date for that is 18. The bottom age, and the vast, like, it looks like, so if we take that's nearly 20%, 15, so I'd say something like 50 or 50% roughly is like under the age of 25 more, maybe.
Yeah, it's a very young fandom, to the point where So the age cutoff varies slightly, but it seems to be roughly 30 years of age. At 30 years of age, you're called a grey muzzle, which it does show how young the fandom is, because in the outside of the furry community, being 30 is not actually all that old. But in the furry community, that's like, you're a grey muzzle. You're an elder statesman.
Page 6 has an extremely interesting graph, and the graphs are actual age and subjective age of furries. So it says 25% of furries say that their subjective age is between 18 and 21, whereas only roughly 20% are actually in that age group. But about 10% of people identify in the age group of 10 to 17, which is really interesting, whereas in their surveys, their cutoff was 18. So 0% of their survey participants are actually in that age group. And by the looks of it, roughly 2% actually identify as less than 10, or their subjective age is less than 10, which is super interesting.
Baby furs.
Yeah.
Baby furs is one of the more disturbing parts of this. It is like furry role-playing or depicting very young people.
That's really strange. I don't even know if... Yeah, that's really weird.
That was... Yeah, so
that makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, and it's... Okay, so this is... Baby furs are definitely a minority within the furry community. And that was one of the groups that the burned furs targeted and said, like, this is not okay to have in the community and it's not okay to tolerate. I don't quite know where I fall. It's the sort of thing where, like, if you are just pretending to be someone of that age among other adults, and I really want to reinforce adults pretending to be people of that age, like, if it's consensual, fine. The thing is, like, that sort of behavior of depicting underage people, even if they're furries, they're still anthropomorphic. The implication is still that they're children.
Yeah.
Like that, I just feel like that's a slippery slope.
I'd feel
that's like, stay away from that shit.
Uncomfortable if I was around anybody like that.
That's another yum that I'm very comfortable yucking.
Yeah,
like just stay the fuck away from.
Yeah,
kids.
and there's it's strange. There's this sexual fetish. What's it called? It's like where people pretend that they're like babies or whatever. Have you heard of this? Like,
I did see that.
I don't know what it's called.
Adult diaper or something.
Yeah. So if you fuse that with furry, man, this is a strange episode. Anyways, back to the demographics.
Very white.
Very white. Yeah, overwhelmingly white. 83% white.
Yeah.
There we go. First Nations repping. I mean, these are Native Americans, not Native Australians. So I can't. But at least there's some representation
what's furdom like in the Australian Aboriginal community?
I don't know of any Aboriginal furries. I personally don't know them.
You've got to make it a thing.
At least in like the parts of like the Aboriginal community, like, because I'm from New South Wales originally, so a lot of my family, like, I just don't even think it would be tolerated. Like, a lot of my family and stuff are like really into football and that sort of thing. So like, by football I mean like NRL, rugby league and stuff, and it's just not I just don't see a kid in one of my communities back home saying that they're a furry going down well at all.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Like, this seems like a pretty white thing to do.
Oh, you know what's even funny? It's page 8, like, percentage of fandom identifying as Asian. So remember, 83% of furries are white, and yet 18, and yet, oh no, sorry, I'm misreading the graph. Sorry,
this is anime online.
That was anime online. I was just about to say that it was the furries, but no, obviously it's the anime people who are over-identifying as Asian.
Yeah. It's also a very, very male-dominated community. So of the people surveyed, 72% were of the male sex. 67% identified with the male gender. So
that's interesting.
Yeah. And actually, I'm not. Well, I'm sure we'll find the data here as well. The
'Cause they're
community
comparing.
is. Yeah, there are many more gay and bi people, many more transgender people within the furry community than there are within like the community at
Oh
large.
yeah, yeah.
And it's so this is a nice aspect of it. It's a very accepting space. In the case of some things like baby furs or zoophilia, I think they could probably stand to be a bit more
A little bit less
judgmental. But
accepting in some
yeah,
situations.
but yeah, it's a very or a much more accepting community.
Yeah, which is I can understand why people who might be otherwise marginalized in some way or like part of a subgroup that is already feels excluded or is excluded, seeing furries as potentially a community that's more accepting than other subcultures. Like for example, like a lot of sports subcultures, say like footy in Australia or NFL in the US, don't really strike me as particularly accepting communities.
No,
So
not
if
really.
you were, say, like a disabled, transgendered, mixed race person, and you look at like, like AFL in Australia, you're probably not thinking, oh yeah, that's a place where I can go and feel safe and accepted. So maybe they're looking for it's one of the communities where they can find some more open minded people.
Yeah, yeah. And the male skewing also doesn't surprise me because it's not all about porn with furries, but just like furry porn strikes me as a dude thing. It's like it's a white dude thing.
Why? It's so weird.
I say this as a white dude,
So weird.
but this furdom seems like a white man kind of scene, and it kind of is.
I'm not going to pass judgment as a non-white male. I'm just going to
Non-white.
say that, like, I'm not going to disagree with your character. Income is interesting, like pretty low income, but they have to control for the age. Like they have a lot of young people, so like if you control for age, maybe there's nothing interesting there.
If you control for age, then it's kind of expected because it's like very few people under 25 are earning massive incomes. It's just not the time of your life.
A lot of the other statistics seem to be like because they haven't controlled for age. Like say a lot of them live with their parents, but it's like but if you're 22, you're probably living with your parents still.
Yeah.
Oh wow, spirituality and religion's interesting. They have like more than 50% strongly disagree with being religious.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if this would fit into
that doesn't surprise me. My guess is that this is probably a fairly like white middle class kind of movement or kind of fandom. While you definitely so in the United States where I think these data were collected, a lot of white middle class people are going to be Christian, but at the same time, it's the white middle class which is where a lot of the like they call it atheism, but white middle class atheism is really not being Christian. You don't have many like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins atheists bragging that they're not Hindus. It's always in opposition to Christianity. So that's expected. That's or at least not surprising.
Yeah, and we've spoken in private, Jack and I have spoken a lot about meaning and religion and that sort of stuff. And I think we've had some of those conversations on the podcast. One of the questions that came up for me and Jack has been like the role of different, I suppose, cultural phenomena in filling that God-shaped hole in our hearts in a secular technological civilization. And I guess looking at this, the rate of non-spirituality. So like it says like something like 33% are either atheists or agnostics, whereas only 24% are Christian. So I wonder to what degree communities like this are fulfilling that part of religion that's to do with like having a community.
Probably to a very large
So you
extent,
have these
I'd
secular
anticipate.
these secular subcultures that are playing the role of community that maybe 50 years ago or 100 years ago that would have been entirely filled by your temple.
Like, I doubt it fulfills that any sort of transcendent sense of meaning, but I think at least in terms of community, it's probably important. And not merely community as in it's a place to meet people, but it is a place to meet people where there's an assumed cultural understanding. So it's a place where you can go and use furry terminology and expect to be understood.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Yeah, it's really interesting. These statistics, and I mean, obviously they're 8 years, maybe 7 or 8 years now out of date. So it'd be interesting if they published another report like this to see what the community is looking like at an aggregate level now. It's really interesting though.
I expect the fandom has only grown in the years after the publication of this particular research article. Because convention attendance, for example, COVID being the exception, but that's not really a reflection of how engaged the fandom is. The number of people attending conventions has just been going up. Interestingly, too, in a few places, I did read about people within the furry community saying that this is evidence that being furry is going to go mainstream eventually. So they just extrapolate out the growth in attendance numbers for conventions.
they don't take into account that maybe it's an S curve rather than just a pure hyperbolic.
Yeah. Or it might even just be a greater utilization of people already within the furry community attending conferences rather than the proportion of people who attend conferences within the broader furry community remaining fixed, and it all being a function just of expanding the size of the furry community.
This isn't Uber or like a network technology, guys. You don't just get to extrapolate out the curve to infinity.
It's also, I wonder to what extent many furries would actually want furdom to go mainstream.
I imagine they wouldn't like it.
Because, so on one hand, I'm sure it's not fun at all seeing a community that you really identify with, that you really like, being dismissed as just for perverts or just for people who want to have sex with animals, or a variety of these things that, at least from my reading, have been experienced by many furries. I'm sure that's not nice, but at the same time, there does seem to be they seem to really enjoy this sense of belonging to this special club with its own culture, its own, if not language, then at least new terms that they use that are not understood by outsiders. This sense of belonging to this insular special group, I do anticipate many of them enjoy. And that probably also goes some way to explaining the appeal of furry conferences to people, that it's this place you can go and you're no longer an individual secret furry in a community of non-furries. You're now with furries, other furries, and you can communicate in real life as you would have communicated online up to that point. The conferences are really interesting though, and in some ways they both represent what I think are the best aspects of the furry community, in that it's a place where people who might not feel like they fit in other places can go and feel a real sense of community. They're places of artistic generation. At the same time, though, some of the furry stereotypes that many furry websites say are absolutely untrue are kind of hinted to have elements of truth to them in aspects of the convention. So, for example, I think there's the 621 rule.
What's that?
I found
What's the 621 rule? Sounds suspicious. I'm deeply suspicious.
Yeah. So apparently, this is common knowledge for furry convention attendees. The 621 rule: get 6 hours of good sleep each night, eat 2 good meals a day, take 1 good shower each morning. So among like on almost all of the convention etiquette guides I saw, they very quickly tell people to shower and to wash. And it's like, look,
fair enough, I guess.
I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying in most communities, do you need to keep telling people to wash?
So it's a bunch of horny young adults between the age of like 18 and 24 for the most part, running around all day, like having fun doing their thing that they like doing, might just forget to have a shower. And probably the overwhelming majority of them are male, I imagine.
Oh, I'm sure. There's also the idea of furry, confunk. Confunk or convention funk. It's all the dirt and odors that accumulate on your body during the course of a convention. And they say that this can leave, if you don't wash it off, to con crud, which is like convention illness. So as expected at furry conventions, like probably at any
People
convention, like it's a great spot for infectious diseases. But I'm assuming, this is showing my bias, I'm assuming it's similar at some anime conventions. There are just certain fandoms which are not famed for hygiene. And for whatever reason, the furry community, at least at the conventions, seems to have a hygiene problem. Because otherwise, why would there be so many instances of organizers or people who go to conventions saying you need to wash? Like you need to have at least a shower each day.
I think it's a strange thing. Do you reckon they end up with con dick cheese? Because they haven't washed their dick in like 6 days, running around in their fursuit. That horrendous funk coming off their furry cocks.
Their junk.
Funk off the junk.
Yeah.
Hey, there's another interesting part from the First Science publication.
Yeah.
That's looking at furry motivation. Really interesting. It says that it looks something like 65% of respondents answered 5, 6, or 7 out of 7 for the question of like belongingness, your motivation.
Okay. So there's a scale. There's a scale of agreement.
Yeah, strongly disagree
for questions where 1 is strongly disagree, up to 7 strongly agree. And okay, so they asked your motivation for joining the furry fandom. Is it belongingness?
Strongly agree. Most people agree or strongly agree. Which is really interesting. I mean, it's kind of, as we were sort of saying before, it's not entirely surprising. But it is. What's interesting is it's much higher. Belongingness is much higher a motivation within the furry community than, by the looks of it, the anime community and the sports community.
Yeah.
Another interesting one was aesthetics and beauty. Seems to be not as strongly biased, but still, it's a thing. Self-esteem. Oh, escape. Look at escape on page 40.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It's incredibly strong.
Oh, that's heavily skewed towards the 7. The
yes, nearly 35% of participants said strongly agree. 20% said 6 out of 7, and another 20% said 5 out of 7. So for that would mean like 2020. So over 70% of people, are saying that they're escaping. That's super interesting.
And then the next chart is fan motivation. Entertainment is also very heavily skewed towards 6 and 7 on the agreement scale.
Fantastic.
There's a tiny number of people who have strongly disagree. I really wonder which furries are like,
I'm not here for the entertainment.
This is not entertaining at all. I don't like it, but I'm still engaging.
I'm only here for the aesthetic appreciation.
The aesthetic appreciation, which is painful. Not entertaining.
Attention. Not that many people are into it because of attention, it seems, which is cool.
Yeah.
Sexual attraction is not nearly as strongly skewed as one might think. Only 20% of respondents said they strongly agree. Can I actually, you know what? I might read out this section underneath sexual attraction.
Yeah.
It says, so just so you guys know, 15% of respondents said strongly disagree with the sexual attraction motivation, whereas 20% said strongly agree. 15% roughly said 6 out of 7, and another 15% said 5 out of 7. So still a fair chunk of change.
It's still definitely skewed
kind of
towards
into
sexual attraction being a motivator.
So it says underneath in discussing this point, quote, while stereotypes often exclusively portray furries as people with a fetish, the data, see the figure above, suggests more variability of responses. While about 23% of the fandom states that sexual attraction has nothing or very little to do with furry interests, about 37% of respondents stated that sexual attraction to furry content is a motivator for their participation. Compared to other fandoms, furries are more likely to be motivated by sex. However, 2 caveats should be noted. First, the importance of sex is below the midpoint of the scale, less than 4 out of 7, suggesting that more important is not the same thing as very important. Second, and perhaps more importantly, sex as a motivator was far lower for furries than either belongingness or entertainment, suggesting that while sex is certainly a motivator for some furries, it is not the primary motivating factor for most furries. This is also why it is factually incorrect to define the furry fandom as, quote, a fetish. Were this the case, one would expect sex to be a primary motivator of furry interest, while little variability in the data, like the responses distribution for entertainment or belongingness.
Yeah, I think that's very fair, and I wouldn't define furry fandom as a fetish. I'd say it's a community which can turn to fetishism very easily and very quickly, and just the massive furry porn does suggest that.
The mass and quantity and diversity.
Yeah.
It just says so.
And also the money in it. So apparently a lot of furry artists so some of them will draw porn just because they like furry porn and want to produce more of it. Many of them will produce a lot of furry porn because that's just what gets money. Like, that's what people are going to pay for. While it might not be the most important aspect of the furry community to many furries, there's still kind of revealed preference at work. Like, a lot of people, or at least there's a lot of furry porn being consumed, and it's unlikely that like 2% of the community is just consuming masses and masses and
look,
masses of porn. It's probably
I'm sure
more
something close to 100% of furries have at least had a look.
Yeah.
Can I read another section? This is furry as a choice. This is super interesting. Furry as a choice. So it's got a graph down here that explains belief that furry is a choice, and you can.
Wait, sorry to interrupt. The fan motivation, sexual attraction, comparing furries
to anime,
other communities. There's sports fans. So sports fans
much lower.
Like it's very low. The sexual attraction being a motivation for watching sport, but there are still some.
Suppose it depends what sports you're watching.
What sport you're watching? Powerlifting. Just want a big, sweaty, hairy dude in a squat suit. The most aesthetic sport on earth.
So furry as a choice. So there's 2 responses. Well, there was 3 responses, but they seem to have left out that I don't know. But you can say, yes, furry is a choice, or no, furry is not a choice. But then they disaggregated the respondents between furry respondents and non-furry respondents. And 30% of furries said that being a furry is a choice, whereas 45% of non-furries said that being a furry is a choice. And nearly 40% of furries said that no, it is not a choice, whereas only about 20% of non-furries said that it's not a choice. So there's this strong bias towards, amongst furries, the belief that being a furry is not a choice. It's somehow a part of your identity or character composition. And the discussion says that furries were twice as likely as non-furries to say that furry was not a choice. This may highlight a potential point of tension between furries and non-furries who may hold negative attitudes towards furries. To the extent that non-furries believe that a person who chooses to be a furry could simply, quote, stop being furry to avoid social stigma, they may feel even more negatively about the person. Conversely, to the extent that a furry feels that they are unable to change who they are, i.e., what they find interesting, they may feel powerless against stigma or feel compelled to conceal their furry identity. That's really interesting. It's like,
yeah,
is it a choice to be a furry? I suppose we don't really have control over our interests, do we? But I suppose we do have a control over whether and to what degree we engage with those interests. Like, I really love video games, but I don't play video games. I'm not saying that being a gamer is the same thing. I don't have a choice, man.
Being a gamer is fucking worse. Gamers shouldn't have any rights.
Below furries in the social hierarchy. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because I suppose, furries do cop a lot of stigma, don't they?
They do. I think this is a definitely noticeable trend, and it's based upon a really big unexamined assumption. So I've noticed many communities that attract stigma
started on Tumblr.
Are positioning themselves as not a choice. It's something that can't be changed and therefore shouldn't be judged. The really big assumption there is that you should not be able to judge something that cannot be changed. Because
such as
with this, suppose
race.
Suppose people say, okay, being furry is not a choice. It's still assuming that if it is not a choice, then you can't judge it. I mean, someone could to that say, well, I don't care if it's a choice or not. You can still be judged.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, just because something's innate, should it be judged or not? That's really interesting.
And I think that's a really big cultural assumption. So that's, I think, all throughout our society, at least Western culture, that seems to be the case, that people assume that something that can't be changed shouldn't be judged, or at least are much less inclined to judge something that can't be changed.
That's a really interesting point. So I was thinking about that with regards to gay marriage recently. Like, a friend of mine who's gay was talking about like gay marriage, and what's interesting about the conversation, just like 10 years ago when the plebiscite happened in Australia, there's a lot of the conversation was about whether or not it's a choice. And my friend was saying, like, it's not a choice. So, like, why should I be excluded from this institution or whatever? And I was thinking, like, well, it's kind of beside the point whether or not it's a choice. Like, what? Like, even if it were a choice, like, you should still be allowed to marry whoever you want. Like, I don't really see why that's the sticking point here. Like, that to the degree to which it's a choice. Like, if you want to fuck a dude, like, just like, go ahead, be my friend, even if you don't like doing it. And yeah, with this stuff, it's like it's almost like if you're saying, I suppose, being a furry is not a choice. Is it some way to try to say, like, well, people shouldn't be discriminated for some sort of invariant that they don't have control over? Is that what they're saying?
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. And I anticipate it will be probably rhetorically tied to something like being gay.
Yeah, or
which
race,
is like which is, at least now in the West, it's mostly accepted. And much of the argument for it has been, well, it's an invariant. People can't change it. That's who they are. And so it should be accepted. And I anticipate this particular section is also hinting at that. It's like, okay, being furry should be accepted because it too is an invariant. It's part of identity and therefore shouldn't be judged.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, there's like, say a zoophile, that might be invariant. They might have an innate, unchangeable sexual preference towards Great Danes, but that does,
yeah. Or even more threatening is I've heard quite a few people say that pedophilia is also an invariant, and suppose it is invariant. I actually don't care.
Yeah, it's beside the point. It's like, okay, say,
I don't care if it's invariant.
That is a part of your sexual construction and you don't have any control over it. It's like, well, keep it in your pants. Like, don't act on it if that is the case. And that's kind of the end of the conversation. That's why I think like some of these like trying to make something an invariant is, or like the argument from invariance or essentialism or something like that is, sometimes it seems like a distraction to me, or it seems beside the point.
Yeah. So it's interesting that they collected these data around being a furry, like furry is a choice. And they're not explicitly saying that it should be used, or this is evidence that being a furry shouldn't be judged. I'm kind of inferring that just from the cultural milieu within which this is occurring. And it's like what you were saying with it being beside the point. Like with being a furry, like I don't have a problem with someone being a furry. It's like whether it's a choice or not actually doesn't really change my kind of ambivalence of, okay, fine, do it. Like if that's what you want to do, fine.
Yeah. I don't really care. It doesn't really hurt anybody.
Yeah.
I think like you can be a furry and a creep, but you can also be be not a furry and a creep, and you can be a furry and not a creep. So like whatever. Actually, there was a really interesting page which is under construction on the First Science website, unfortunately, but maybe you can see if there's somewhere in the in the report about autism in
I did come across that
in the furry community, which I found really interesting, because I wonder if there is a high representation of people with neurodivergence in this community, like not necessarily
at
autism,
least
like
from
maybe different ones as well.
So the problem is always it's just inherent to basically any measurement problem, is that certain things are just more visible than other things. And is it that neurodivergent people within the furry community are more likely to talk about being neurodivergent? They're more likely to produce cultural artifacts talking about that, perhaps. But at least reading about the furry community, I did get the impression that there are a lot of neurodivergent people, in part because I expect it's quite accepting of them, or very accepting of them. And I think that could be a really positive aspect of the furry community, that it is a place where, say, autistic people can go and feel like they're not judged.
Yeah.
And
you won't be judged if you're autistic
accepted
in the book club from hell. You got 2 autistic co-hosts.
No,
you're welcome here. We got some pretty neurodivergent people in the Discord. Definitely got some people who are at least obsessive.
Yeah, I would say trait obsessiveness
extremely high in our Discord. If that's not a complete high sensitivity inclusion criteria to be diagnosed with autism, but listening to us. Yeah, so I found that really interesting, because if they are a community where they're more accepting, because they're already kind of like, again, like talking about my gay friends, like a number of my gay friends who I've spoken to about this, not furries, but other stuff, sort of often cite the reason why they may be like more accepting or able to engage things like, say, transgenderism or whatever, is because they grew up feeling like they were already outsiders. So they're already acclimated to being outside the norm in terms of what their perspective is compared to what, say, like the rest of society thinks. So you have these communities that are already on the outside. They might already be predisposed towards like being more accepting of people.
Yeah. And if there is a place where neurodivergent people can go and feel like a part of a community where being neurodivergent is not something that they have to hide, I think that's a really positive aspect.
I guess, because you've got the fursona potentially, you can, like...
Yeah, and you're right. The fursona might also allow them to have almost distance from the person they are in day-to-day life, where they have to worry about, I don't know, being autistic in a non-autistic world. Although, that said, with
Jack immediately takes that
increasing technicization of the world, I think the world is becoming more autistic.
Remember with Spangler which we need to finish off. We finish off in the new year. The Strangler came up with the schizo autistic axes. It's like the world is becoming both more autistic and more schizo. The bigger the internet gets, and definitely the wilder the recommendation algorithms get. Like, I got a recommendation because I watched an Elon Musk getting into an argument with Alex Jones and Andrew Tate the other day. I'm now getting Andrew Tate suggestions, but I've also been watching a lot of The Lord of the Rings. So I got this one suggestion from the algorithm saying, like, The Lord of the Rings if Gollum was Andrew Tate. And then it's like a mashup of
Andrew
Gollum.
Tate is such a goober. I felt so let down by him because I'd heard so much about how he's this extremely controversial figure, just dropping inflammatory things left, right, and center. He'll just say the craziest shit. And then I listened to him. He's such a goober. I got, like, if this is what people are getting in a moral panic over.
He's a bit of a douchebag.
Like, he's inflamed. Like, he says vile stuff about women and things.
That's really what he got.
A, on the internet,
about, right?
That is not unusual. B, he's just... I think part of it might be his accent. His accent and his voice and the way he moves when he speaks just makes it impossible for me to take him, like, not seriously, but not even seriously as a joke.
He's not very good villain material, is he? I think he's just really heinously sexist, right? He's just really sexist. So
yeah. But I was expecting more from what I'd heard of him. Then he's just villain. Like this dude with a weird accent and a kind of jelly bean face saying rude things about women. I expected way more from him, but he was such a letdown. Anyway, we'll probably do an Andrew Tate episode eventually, but I felt so disappointed.
Do an Andrew Tate episode. He's
Alex Jones lives up to the hype.
Alex Jones is
more.
Way cooler than Andrew Tate.
Alex Jones is much more fun to listen to because it feels like that is what acute psychosis feels like. Just listening to Alex Jones for long enough, just the intensely free associative reasoning.
I would love to listen to Jordan Peterson get into an argument with Alex Jones. Just let them off. Let them loose on one another.
I do not think
just the kings of associative thinking, loose associative thinking.
No, okay. So getting into an argument is one thing. Imagine listening to them violently agreeing with each other.
Yeah, just bitching about.
Within 30 seconds, you will lose your grip on
bitching
reality.
About the globalists and the environmentalists.
The globalists were in the belly of the beast.
That's so funny.
It sounds horrifying. That sounds like something that I couldn't.
I found another interesting part of the furry paper. They said sexual orientation, and they're comparing non-furries with furries. So, exclusively heterosexual. 80% of non-furries said they're exclusively heterosexual, and then there's a very small number of like the rest of the range up to exclusively homosexual amongst non-furries. Whereas the furries have a nice, fairly even spread across all the different like sort of exclusively heterosexual, equally homosexual, heterosexual, and then exclusively homosexual. They have a lot more even spread across all of those, which I found interesting. That's kind of nice. That's it. Like sexual orientation. Yep. It's kind of, again, it's, I guess if it's already like a kind of like it sort of fits into all the stuff that we've already been saying.
Yeah. Those data didn't really surprise me. Like with the neurodivergent stuff, like it's a nice aspect of the furry community that it's non-judgmental along those axes of, say, sexual orientation or neurodivergence.
60% of people who have a partner in the furry community say that they met as furries. That is crazy.
Okay, so I can see that happening as well. So if it depends on to what extent or how central being a furry is to your identity. Like if it's just something that you're kind of interested in, I suppose it'd be less important. But if you're a really diehard furry and you're going to conventions, you might even have a fursuit. Like it's kind of obvious. So you're much more likely to get into a relationship with someone else who's into the same stuff that you are And where are you going to find those sorts of people? So also in the furry community. So that makes a lot of sense.
I guess what I'm getting out of this is that it's actually being a furry is actually potentially quite a significant part of somebody's life. It's not just like a minor interest.
And there's definitely a spectrum.
Yeah.
There's definitely a spectrum because there are some people who they're just into drawings of anthropomorphic animals and it doesn't go much beyond that. But there do seem to be quite a few people who really get into this community. And I guess naturally they're going to interact with other people who are really into the community. And that's probably where a lot of the generativity comes from.
One more thing about porn. They've got a little frequency of porn use here. And one question they have is, what percentage of the furry art that you view as pornographic? And men said 50%. 50% of male respondents just said, yeah, like half of the art that I consume is porn.
Yeah. Which, because I guess like it depends on how you want to spin it. So for people who really want to present the furry community as not being about porn, could say, look, half the stuff they're consuming is not porn, but it does mean it's actually half of the time you're interacting with art that's furry is pornographic. Because think about what proportion of basically any other medium you interact with being porn, and then compare it to 50% of people saying, half.
I don't know, I guess it'd be interesting to see anime side by side of anime.
Anime, yeah.
I imagine that would be pretty high.
It'd be high, 50%. But probably not 50%, just because with anime, there are so many non-pornographic anime series. There's a lot of non-porn content that people can be consuming. My guess is it's going to be less than 50%. But then again, I don't watch anime, so I don't know much about that community.
Looks like they have a much higher prevalence of artists as well than maybe like
doesn't surprise me at all.
Mainstream.
Like, it's such a creative community. It doesn't surprise me at all that there are a lot of artists, particularly visual artists, given the centrality of art to the furry community.
Overall, what I'm getting from like these stats and sorry, I was going to make a sensible point before I make a sensible point. They've got a section 8.2 attitudes towards bronies.
What do you think of bronies?
Think of bronies? Furry. Let me see. So it seems as though furries have a more positive attitude towards bronies than the mainstream. Is essentially what we're picking up.
But I was interested in that because it really could go either way. Because on one hand, I'm sure furries are much more understanding of bronies. In the both, so they're not the same, but there's a lot of overlap between being into anthropomorphic cartoon animals and being into like talking cartoon ponies. There's a lot of overlap. But in that overlap, oftentimes fandoms, when they're interested in things where there's a lot of overlap, get really, really they really tribalize and don't like the other fandom that's too similar to them. So it's interesting to see that it's gone much more in the direction.
Wait a second. No, there's another section here that says most relevant, however, was the fact that furries also rated bronies significantly more negative than they did the average non-furry, suggesting that their negative attitudes were specific to the brony fandom and not just anyone who is not furry. Oh, I think I might have been reading it the other way around. Sorry, before it was saying like bronies. Let me see. Well, the average. The data shows that while bronies felt positively about bronies, furries had mixed feelings. Yeah, so bronies are not so hard on furries, but furries are kind of hard on bronies.
I do often find there are these hierarchies in how totalizing a fandom is, in that I found that so many furries and many otherkin don't seem to quite trust each other, but it did strike me reading through otherkin stuff, reading through furry stuff, that probably more otherkin look down on furries than furries look down on otherkin. Because in some way, like, identifying as an animal is more totalizing than identifying with a fursona, which could be a wolf or a fox or a dog or a big cat, dragon, etc. And then, I guess with furries, it's a more totalizing community than, brony's just like one type of animal.
And one particular depiction of them. Of animals.
Yeah, the gatekeeping aspect is quite funny. There was I think it was the Vor page on WikiFur I got real gatekeeping energy from, because they were gatekeeping what qualifies as Vor porn and what doesn't. And I thought, listen, mate, this is not a hill I would die on. I'm not going to gatekeep what is and what isn't furry Vor.
Okay, so I just adding to that point about like the reasons why they might be. So discriminating against bronies. Section 8.3, stigma justification. Quote, whilst there are many furries who hold positive opinions of bronies, it raises the question of why so many furries feel negatively, or at least ambivalently, towards bronies. We asked participants if they had a negative attitude towards bronies to indicate why they felt that way. These responses were coded, blah, blah, blah. And here's some of the reasons why. So 17% of furries said that bronies are obnoxious, excessive, or attempt to force their culture on others. 15% said that bronies are just not the same as furries. 13% that they just have a general dislike for them. 12% of furries said they don't dislike the culture itself, but dislike specific bronies. Another 12% said it's unimaginative, a fad, shallow, or one-dimensional. And another 12% said it's silly, dumb, or immature.
That's really fun. That could almost be like metal fans talking about hardcore fans, or the other way around. It's always these communities where it's like they like things that are quite similar but not exactly the same, and that just engenders so much completely irrational distrust.
That's so weird.
Yeah. So much of this just could be the dynamics between like
because as an outsider, I would have thought that being a brony is potentially a proper subset of being a furry. But apparently this is just not the case. Like there's actually some antagonism, and furries don't apparently really like bronies.
That is really funny. Is very funny. That is very good. What about this part? So I'm looking at, section 3 is on species choice for the fursona. So you've got species popularity is interesting. So most popular fursona species, most popular, a bit over 14%, is hybrid. But then very closely following hybrid is wolf. Then you've got a bit of you've got quite a drop to maybe 11, 12%. Fox, then dog, then big cat, dragon, then mythical.
I really like that. Kind of to be expected. I've seen a lot of wolf. There's something about wolves that,
and then
really
most
like.
Popular fursona hybrids. So the most popular is dog/wolf, and then you've got fox/wolf. Then those are by far the most popular. Then a big drop to dragon/wolf. So dog wolf, fox wolf. Considering that besides hybrids, the most popular are wolves and foxes, I'd say So wolf and fox and dog are by far the most popular. Fursona species,
which you can see in
considering it's like hybrid. A lot of the time, it's we'll just put a wolf and a fox together, or a wolf and a dog together. So they've got like most popular wolf fursonas, most popular fox fursonas. Unspecified is basically always the most popular subgroup. It is interesting getting into mythical fursonas. So I didn't see this coming. So the most common mythical fursona type is Pokemon.
Nice.
Probably like 26, 27%. Then Griffin at 14%. And then video game at 10%.
I wonder which video games, like Fallout New Vegas or Halo Combat Evolved, just pretending to be a swamp.
Be one of the grunts.
He's coming!
Okay, so you've got most popular Pokemon personas.
Run.
So they've got the most popular is other at 20%, and that represents 63% of all Pokemon. The most common single Pokemon is Lucario. What is Lucario?
Yeah, Lucario is cool.
Here we go. That looks pretty. It looks like a blue fox with some spikes on it.
It's just a cool blue fox.
We'll just put that down to cool fox. What do we get next? Raichu. Okay, Raichu is old enough that I had a Raichu.
When did Lucario come along? Must be a more modern one. It's after our time.
Yeah, I don't recognize that one.
Pretty cool though.
Raichu, Eevee, Vaporeon, Absol, Leafeon. Yeah. So these are all kind of the expected ones. Yeah.
Not many Pikachus. Pikachu's lame. Raichu's way cooler.
Most popular marsupial personas, Kangaroo, over 70%.
Yeah,
Kangaroo is crushing it among marsupial personas. I mean, I guess what else would you be? Like a possum?
I'd be a patty melon.
Those things are so funny looking.
Everybody who's listening, go and look up patty melon.
Go and look up a patty melon
in Tasmania.
Majestic
these little, they're kind of like,
they just look like a
little squat kangaroo looking creatures. They're more closely related to wallabies, but they got big fat asses. They should be the on the emblem for Tasmania. Patty melons. Oh, little fatties.
One very interesting thing. So section 3.3, reasons for species choice. So again, it's the 1 to 7 agreement scale, 1 being not at all, 7 being very much agreement. Species choice, innate connection. So by far, it was not at all 1 on the agreement scale that was the most popular selection at, I'd say, 33%. So this is a big distinction between being a furry and being an otherkin, or between most of the furry community and the otherkin community. Is a lot of the time people don't really feel a deep innate connection to their fursona. They might feel some, like you definitely have some people. You've got some distribution of between say 2 and 4 on the agreement scale, but most people are saying that they're not really feeling a really, really deep innate connection with their fursona species. It's also few respondents feel trapped in a human body, that they're an alternate species.
Yeah, you can see that distinction between otherkin and furries coming through.
Where basically all otherkin will be saying very much feel trapped in a human body. So reasons why they do select the fursona is they share characteristics. And this is interesting. So the answers to this one, why did you choose your species choice on the basis of shared characteristics? You have many more people. It's clustering much more on the agreement side of the scale.
Yeah, that section was really interesting. There's also a section a little bit after that where they talk about like what it represents. I'll see if I can find it again. Like 9 something or 8 something. No, I can't. Where they talk about like why, like what does it mean to you? See if we can find this. For your furry, is it allowing you to be like your ideal self or whatever? And yeah, that was one of the strongest responses was, yeah, it allows me to explore novel personality traits, but also it allows me to be my ideal self.
Yeah.
So if you're like introverted, it's an opportunity for you to kind of put on this fursona that is much more extroverted or more attractive or charismatic or whatever. Yeah, really interesting.
Yeah. Interestingly, though, it also... So they asked respondents, how similar is your fursona to yourself? And the results cluster very strongly in the agreement side of things. So the fursona seems to be... It's not qualitatively different from the person. It might be an accentuation of some of their characteristics, but it's, at least for most of these respondents, similar to their self, or their self outside of the fursona.
Yeah, super interesting. I've got a part here that a couple of parts here that are a little bit further along, which I found really interesting. This section about bullying, which I want to read out a little part of it. It says, quote, Participants were asked about the extent to which they experienced different types of bullying at different points in their lives, even after statistically controlling for the fact that furries are more likely to be non-heterosexual or transgender, both of which themselves are associated with a history of bullying. Furries still experienced significantly more bullying than the average person, whether measured as being physically beaten up, teased, or ostracized. Many furries, 48%, reported being bullied from the age of 4 to 10. 61% of furries reported being bullied from the ages of 8 to 11, and 15% report being bullied from the ages of 19 to 24. This suggests not only that furries are more likely than the average person to be bullied, almost twice as likely in the same age group, but the majority of furries are bullied at some point in their lives. The difference in bullying were almost always prominent during the ages of 8 to 11, which is to be expected, I suppose. Yeah, and so I found that was really interesting. It's like even controlling for being, say, transgendered or whatever, being a furry is going to make your life harder, at least in high school. Yeah, not surprising. Then the section after that is also really, really interesting, which I think you might like to discuss, which is the intra-fandom stigma. So the stigma between different subsets of or different subcommunities within furrydom. And so they've got basically an axis here, which is saying like how positive.
Which section?
It's page 139 and 140. Okay. The graph is basically saying, do people have a negative or a positive view towards these different types, different subgroups within the furry community? And obviously, say artists and writers and musicians are very highly regarded. Suitors as well, which I assume means people who make the furry suits. Therians and other kin, not quite neutral, a little bit positive, but like essentially neutral. Yeah. But then it has.
But consider though that otherkin probably within the broader community would be viewed negatively. Yes. That's like that actually is.
That's a good,
very
that's
tolerant.
A highly tolerant community. Yeah. But then it has fetishes, slightly negative, very slightly. It's like probably essentially neutral. Vampires not viewed well, and baby furs and Nazi
furs are
viewed very negatively.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, Nazi furs are not viewed as negatively as artists are viewed positively. I feel like there should be.
Okay, so the wiki fur page on Nazi furs was very, very funny because it's this. It feels very defensive.
Of the Nazi furs.
So I quote, here we go. The Nazi furs symbol is a black paw on a white circle against a red background. The black, white, red color scheme is reminiscent of the state flag of Nazi Germany and is often worn in the form of an armband. According to the moderators of the group, the symbol was created not as a means of spreading hatred or to symbolize intolerance, but in a spirit of understanding that images like the swastika could potentially cause emotional distress to some people. They made sure to reinforce on the Wikifur page about Nazi furs that Nazi furs are not actually Nazis. They just really, really like World War II era German aesthetics and like exploring that period of history, and also really like furries.
Or otherwise known as fursies. Fursies, or Die Deutsch Furmarkt.
It's like if that's what you're into, okay.
Oh, they've also got Soviet
also
furs.
Like I'm gonna find it weird, and I feel like with some of these things, like it's good to try to expect that people are going to, if not not judge, then at least be polite about your interests. I do think though there is a point at which your interests grow so strange that I actually become unsympathetic when people are upset that other people judge them and are impolite about them. And Nazi furs is one of those things. It's like if you're complaining that people are judging you for being into Nazi furs and for wearing a poor armband, I'm actually totally unsympathetic. It's like, well, what the fuck did you think people are gonna say to you? Just exercise some social judgment.
Yeah.
There are certain things. Yeah, there are certain things where it's like you can do it, But just don't be surprised when people think you're a fucking weirdo for being into Adolf Foxler.
Huh. Yeah, I think that's really reasonable. Like, come on, like if you got to have like some self-awareness, right? Like if you're into something really strange,
you need some self-awareness.
Like,
you can be into it. You can have your Nazi fur friends, and you can be Nazi furs together. But at the same time, don't be shocked when normies take one look at you and go, "What the fuck is that?"
yeah. Or like if you walk into a McDonald's with your little Nazi fur band, and like,
no. This is being used to raise awareness about the ability of the swastika to make people feel uncomfortable.
Sure it is. Yeah, there's an interesting discussion about disability in the fandom. Seems as though there's a fairly high rate of disabilities. Furries with disabilities use their fursonas for different functions, with some functions being more frequent. In particular, the most popular fursona function for furries with disabilities was as a means of forgetting one's condition, while hiding one's condition when interacting with others was the second most popular function. They were, so it's a way of, I think some people, the term that I've heard used recently is masking, but it's like very sophisticated form of masking. To hide their disability during interactions if they had low self-esteem or if they had experienced significant depression or anxiety. This suggests that the use of one's persona to interact with others might seem more feasible when one is experiencing significant distress or dissatisfaction with themselves. Yeah, that's super interesting. And it seems like a fairly high proportion of their sample have some sort of cognitive or mental health disability, which is interesting. And I suppose cognitive would include like a fairly broad range of
that could include autism.
Yeah, that's
because I do recall seeing a figure about the prevalence of autism in the furry community is far above that of the broader community.
This is an absolutely fascinating study.
This is a very interesting document.
This is and good find.
Good find,
Levi. Good find, self. That was a general good find to the book club. Well done, book club.
They do talk about post-convention depression here, which I find interesting because I saw it.
They should be talking about post-nut guilt. That's what they should.
I've seen this reference in a lot of places, and it does make sense. So what it is basically furries will go to a furry convention, feel great, feel accepted, feel like they can be. They're in a place where their niche interests are shared by basically everyone there. So they can be very, very open about it. And then they feel really low when they leave the convention. And that, I guess that makes sense. So I don't have the experience of being into like a subgroup that is, that has the dynamics of the furry community where within the community, it's very intense in that like they have their own way of speaking. They have their own cultural touchstones that are commonly understood by other people within the community. And where that understanding just goes off a cliff as soon as you leave the furry community. But I can imagine how if you exist in relative isolation with respect to these interests of yours, and then you go to a place where those interests are suddenly shared, and then you leave again back to the rest of the world, how that could feel really dislocating.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
But I do find it interesting that it seems it's a common enough experience, this post-con depression, that a lot of people talk about it, and it has been studied in this particular...
So fascinating.
I don't know if you call it a paper, but this particular primer on the sociology of furries.
I've never been that into anything that I don't believe I'm a part of, like even it's funny, funnily enough, like say with Bitcoin, which as long-time listeners know, I haven't really been talking that much about Bitcoin in the last like little while.
Yeah, that's true. You feeling okay?
Look, things have been hard recently, Jack. Like I really like it, but I'm not so into it. Like I haven't been to a Bitcoin conference yet.
I don't know. Part of me really wants to go to one of those Miami Bitcoin conferences, and part of me absolutely never wants to go to one of those.
Yeah.
they look like actual insanity, like actual
Complete insanity.
externalized group insanity.
Yeah. And pretty much anything. I don't know. Like, so I guess to me it's an odd, and say with Bitcoin's an interesting thing, because part of the reason why I haven't been talking about it as much recently or whatever is also because I just just once you reach a certain level of understanding, you just achieve this inner peace when it comes to Bitcoin. And you're just okay with the world, because eventually everybody will use Bitcoin and it's fine, and it's just a matter of everybody else catching up with what's the new technology to use for protecting your wealth from being destroyed by the decrepit, degenerate fiat economic system. So, like, you don't need to proselytize as much once the Holy Spirit, once your understanding of Bitcoin has entered your heart. Whereas, like, like with regards to, like being so obsessed with anything especially for like multiple years. So, like, say, maybe you start getting into furries at 20 and then you're in it for maybe 5 years or something, you're going to conferences. I've just never had that experience with anything. And so I don't know really what it means to be so deep into an interest that you're, could you say like your career? I suppose you spend a lot of time doing your career, but I don't know.
So, I would consider myself, I have interests, but I don't think of myself as belonging to any fandom. No. And so, how would you define a fandom? It seems to be a community based around appreciation of some sort of thing. So in the case of furries, the central point seems to be an appreciation of artwork depicting anthropomorphic animals. And then from that, you get, just from enough people interacting around this central point, or these few central points, you get a culture arising within the fandom. And that's a specific sort of thing as compared to people who just like, who are interested in something, but don't engage with some sort of emergent, in some ways exclusive culture that arises around it. So I guess maybe with anime, there seem to be, like, there are people who like anime but aren't part of a fandom, because the fandom, there's some sort of exclusive aspect of being part of the fandom. It's not sufficient to simply like anime. You need to adopt some aspects of that culture to, I guess, really be part of it. And so those fandom, I've never been interested in anything which has those fandom
being
dynamics.
A fan, deep fandom. Yeah. I haven't either. I don't know. Maybe we need to be more obsessive about things, Jack.
Yeah, I feel like there are just other things in my life that need.
Even when I got really into psychedelics, say I go through periods of just getting really into things, and then I'll just move on to my next thing. Like with psychedelics, one of my friends suggested that I go to Entheogenesis Australis, which is a conference.
That's horrible. I say this as someone who genuinely enjoys the psychedelic experience. That doesn't sound fun. That doesn't sound like the sort of thing I want to do.
It's a bunch of people sitting up like outside of Byron Bay or something, like talking about how good mushrooms are. The healing potential of plant medicines. They really need that showering rule at those sorts of conferences too.
Yeah, I imagine that's a sort of fandom where you absolutely would need the showering rule to be enforced. You spray them down with a hose while they're tripping.
Yeah, so even I didn't get into go into conferences and stuff. Maybe we need to be more obsessive about things.
Bitcoin is something where you could become part of a fandom, because I think, like, especially Bitcoin Twitter, like, there's a definite fandom feeling to it.
I think to the degree that I will become a part of quote unquote fandom for Bitcoin, the thing is, it's also just a massive technological revolution. So it's like the people over the last 20 years who have been going to software conferences or whatever, it's like, well, software is pretty important. So it's pretty natural for people to, and also you can make a shitload of money. So that's a pretty strong motivator.
I guess one distinguishing feature is that, like, not everyone who's into Bitcoin is interacting with it in the same way. But I imagine there are a large number of people who are actually either using it a lot or developing,
building companies on
for
top
it or using it.
stuff.
And that also changes. It's not passive consumption of I like looking at pictures of anthropomorphic animals.
Yeah. It's also not a fictional construction. Like, it's a piece of technology. Like, so, yeah, it's substantially different. There will be massive Bitcoin conferences in the future that lots of people will know about, that are even bigger than the ones today. And that's because, like, the Bitcoin part of the global economy is just going to get bigger and bigger. So
I would also say there are Bitcoin conferences and there are Bitcoin conferences. And in a similar sense to with the furry community, how the most brash and outrageous parts of it are oftentimes
like
the very visible
Max
parts.
Kaiser went off his head the other year.
Yeah. Was that when he was like tearing up dollar bills and setting them on fire and things like that?
To zero.
Yeah, so that sort of shit makes me look at it and go, yeah, I'm not interacting with that part of the Bitcoin community. At the same time, it does look pretty fun.
Yeah. I imagine that's also got a pretty strong male bias as well. Except for Lynn Alden. Shout out to Lynn Alden. She's just released a great new book called Broken Money. It's very good. Strongly recommend. If you like learning about Bitcoin, but you don't like Cypherdina Moose's like snide remarks about all the people he disagrees with, then Lynn Alden's a much more reasonable person to read.
Yeah, I have to say, the Bitcoin community, so much of it seems to be built upon real or perceived personal slights. Almost every piece of Bitcoin media I've consumed, almost all of them, there'll be like a section where they just start firing shots.
They just start talking shit about Keynes or whoever.
It's a very personally aggrieved community.
Yeah, they're definitely like, I feel like there's going to be this like stage of development where it's like with Apple. Like, Apple had that 1989 or 1988 Super Bowl commercial where it was 1984, of course. Where the guy like runs into this like room full of people staring at a screen, and then they throw like something at the screen, smash it, and then they had all their marketing about think different and whatnot. And now Apple is like giant megacorp, number one most powerful megacorp in the world.
Yeah.
That's Bitcoin. Like, at the moment, it's still like somewhat fringe, and people know about it, but people who are really like into it are still fringe, and they're quite antagonistic, and they have a lot of gripes with the current system. But over the course of the next like 10 to 20 years, as it becomes mainstream and then the dominant paradigm, like, they're just going to become the grumpy old men who are in charge of the giant mega corporations, and then somebody needs to invent something to take down Bitcoin. But we're still in the like underdog phase.
Yeah. I guess even with that though, like, my interaction with Bitcoin it's something I like. Like, I like it enough to have invested in it.
To have taken out huge amounts of debt to buy as much as you can.
Yeah.
to start shorting things irresponsibly.
But it's also, like, I also don't care enough about it to, like, really get into the weeds with Twitter arguments and things like that on Bitcoin.
Yeah, fair enough.
So I just don't want to have to worry. It's a
totally reasonable thing.
Anyway, what else with furries do you want to talk about? Like, there's the thing with the furry fandom is we could keep talking basically indefinitely. It goes so deep. What about this? Section 12 is about gender. 12.2, treatment due to gender.
Section 13.
Page 149. This is interesting. So...
Yep.
Yeah. So it does seem, broadly speaking, these data suggest that 85% of people interviewed indicated they wish there were more furry women in the fandom. 42% of women disagreed with the statement that women in the fandom are treated as equal to men. So,
wow.
Most women seem to think, they'll have responded to that by saying either women are treated the same as men or they don't have an opinion, but that's still a large proportion of women who feel that they're not treated the same as men.
66% of women felt that women in the fandom were put on a pedestal or revered. Oh, so they're not saying that women are treated equal to men in like a bad way necessarily. Like, they're actually treated like way better, actually.
And 22% felt that women in the fandom were looked down upon, and these two variables were highly correlated.
Yeah, interesting. So you've got this
Which is
weird mixture of
interesting.
both looking down on women and also putting them on a pedestal. That's strange.
Yeah, which is not uncommon
Whoa.
among young men. But bear in mind, most of the community are young men. That's a not uncommon perspective.
68% of women agreed that the fandom was an intimidating place for women. Huh.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. It's the first time that this like inclusivity narrative that we've been exploring has been refuted. So with regards to,
well, not refuted. It's just it's always going to be more complicated than this place is 100% accepting or something like that.
Yeah, sure.
So there are general comments. Many of these sound like, again, it's like young men's relationship with women. So I quote, "Many women express frustration over having male friends who would try to make a relationship sexual or who were friends with the goal of one day becoming more than just friends. In a similar vein, relationship statuses seem to be a barrier for many women who found it difficult to make male friends when they were in a heterosexual relationship." And so I just don't think that's not unique to the furry community. So many of these things, I think, so there will be modifications by virtue of the fact that it is a fandom. It's a group of people who are intensely interested in a niche thing. But I'd say the backbone of these particular relationship dynamics are mostly explained by the fact that much of the fandom is young and is male.
Yeah, fair enough. Another intersection.
Several participants expressed concerns that furry artwork portrayed women in an objectifying, derogatory, disrespectful, or unrealistic fashion. It's porn.
Well, no, they said artwork. They said
artwork.
Course. So, like, that could include non-pornographic art. Okay. So, like, even if they're just drawing a character, that's not engaging in a sexual act.
I would be interested to know, actually, how they define porn in this. It's probably, the you know it when you see it test. But even from Jack, the furry comic we read, there were plenty of parts of that which were not pornographic but were highly sexually suggestive. And I wonder whether they would count that as porn or not, because I've noticed a lot of furry artwork might, or at least that which I've seen and which I looked at for this episode, it's not going to be out and out pornographic, but it's going to be very sexually suggestive.
So this next section that I wanted to read out was the most contentious issues in the community. And I'll just read a little bit of it. It says, at the end of many of our surveys, we asked furries to discuss important ideas or issues that were present in the fandom. We asked whether there were aspects of the fandom they disliked, considered to be a problem, or which they would change if they could. They compiled these and have made a list of some of the most controversial or contentious issues in the furry fandom. So one is the fandom is too sexual and too openly so, e.g. behavior and porn in public settings. The fandom has a negative public image. The fandom includes or is too tolerant of deviant fetishes. There is too much drama and conflict within the fandom, i.e. between subgroups or within local furry groups. There are problematic furs and subgroups in the fandom, such as bronies, therians, baby furs, and Nazi furs.
Brony. I find it weird that bronies are included there, because like my experience of bronies is pretty limited. Like, I've looked into it a little bit, but it seems particularly okay. So when it gets into like clopping, like the masturbating to porn based on cartoon ponies, that's weird.
Why did they have to call it clopping?
Clopping. But the thing is, I wouldn't put that on nearly the same level as like baby furs or Nazi furs.
Yeah.
Anyway, and it's like therians. I guess with bronies and therians, I expect they're considered more problematic within the furry community because they're different, but they're similar enough that those differences are going to really irk people.
Very interesting. Another one down here is bigotry, discrimination, intolerance, and bullying in the fandom, and a recognition that bullying does occur in the fandom, despite the fact that it might not be physical bullying. Significant social bullying occurs, such as rumors and ostracism. Another interesting one is, despite the fandom's purported openness and acceptance, physical disability still receives significant negative attention, and issues such as spirituality and religion are looked down upon or discouraged by the fandom. That's because there's too many fucking new atheists. They ruin everything. Yeah. As an atheist, I just find new atheists
I anticipate there's a big crossover between people who identify as Redditors and people who are furries.
And people who have people who are new God delusion.
Yeah, and think they're fucking galaxy brain because they can pull out I don't like Jesus opinion.
Yeah. I wonder how easy it is to pin down our opinions on what we actually like.
Well, I mean, I'm not trying to disguise my opinion at all.
It's like
open about it.
With myself, for example, being an atheist, but also finding the atheist movement online really obnoxious. Especially Daniel Dennett.
Atheism can mean many things. Why I don't agree with that, or don't identify at all with that new atheist movement, because as I think I said earlier in this episode, it feels like a very immature reaction specifically to Christianity.
Oh yeah, for sure, in the West.
Because again, you never have them say, like, to brag
taking down Hinduism.
They're not Buddhist. In fact, oftentimes they seem to almost fetishize Buddhism, and they almost try to make Buddhism into this like strange Frankenstein's monster of modern liberalism. And then say, oh, it's so much more enlightened. It's like, well, yeah, if you're basically just ignoring it and trying to turn it into...
There's a lot of crazy, crazy shit in Buddhism. They obviously haven't read that much. Yeah, like there's some crazy scenes. I think it's really fun, honestly. Like sometimes like Gautama will just start floating in the air and blasting fire out of his eyes. It's really cool.
That sounds like the sort of stuff that'll get me on board.
Yeah, none of this like compassion crap. Like, let's see some fiery eyes.
I want more eye beams. Yeah, but I don't like that new atheist movement at all. I think it's extremely childish.
But not as much as baby furs and it's called age play. I think age play is seriously questionable.
Yeah, it makes me viscerally uncomfortable. Which, of course, should be the measure of whether something should be permissible or not.
The arbitrary reactions of your body. Yeah.
The arbitrary reactions
of Jack. We all need to defer to Jack's reactions to things. Now, speaking of that last thing, there's the Yiffy Guide to Safer Sex. I don't really want to read it. We're at the end. This has been like 2 hours.
No, can we? Okay, so for those who don't know, Yiffy is like furry porn, and Yiff is onomatopoeic. So it's the noise that I think fox furries make when they're enjoying having sex.
Oh God! Do you think that fox furries actually will make that yiff sound while they're having sex? I bet you they do. Dirty bastards.
I'm sure someone has. I'm sure someone has.
It's just a height of obnoxiousness.
It was like I was introduced in the process of preparing for this episode to the idea of a mersuit. So you've got a fursuit,
mermaiding,
which is like we've talked about. No. So mer is
something else.
I think it's a noise made to express pleasure or sexual pleasure. A mersuit is a fursuit designed with strategically placed holes, such that you can be pleasured while you're wearing your mersuit.
Just yiff all day.
Please don't say it
again. Surely there's going to be like some funny like rap remixes based on yiffing. They see me yiffing.
Probably.
They hate me. They know in my fursuit I'm just too... I don't know. I'll fix it.
Given how generative this community is, I'm sure there's a ton of music about
One thing that I think people should go and look at is the Furry song by Curl the Raven. That's Curl, Kurrel. I don't know how you pronounce it. Curl the Raven. Funny song about furries made by the furry community. So I don't really have anything else to say. I think that finding that survey was really interesting.
Very good.
It's a shame that we spent the first hour.
There's so much more we could talk about. It's just
it's a shame that we spent the first hour talking about furry cock war before fighting, because probably the second half of that conversation was more informative and enlightening, learning about the furry community for our audience than like the first half, but that's okay. You guys, the faithful, stuck around and became enlightened.
Yeah, those who are part of the book club from Hell fandom.
Hey, don't you give anybody any ideas, Jack.
Yeah,
I actively
we will stop doing this if a fandom starts to if there is even the suggestion of it forming. I'm never recording another
I actively discourage any artistic renderings of Jack doing cock for. So funny.
What else have we got to say? Shout out to Rowan.
Which Rowan?
Is there anyone else you want to shout out? Shout out to nice.
Hans is a very interesting person, isn't he? Good on you, Hans. I think we might end up getting like a barbecue inspired by my girlfriend. Has been inspired by Hans and just wants to have like a barbecue with meat on it next to like some barbells in our backyard.
That's a really good idea.
She's really into Sun and Steel.
Oh, what a book.
I don't have anything else to say. I think we're taking a break.
Yeah, we'll take a break around Christmas and New Year's, so that there won't be an upload next week.
Yeah. And then
we'll be back with probably Temple OS.
Yeah, we've got to make a plan for the next year. Temple OS, we've got to finish off Spangler Volume 1. There's been a few other ones thrown out there in the world, on the Discord and stuff, suggestions coming through. So
yeah. And we want to start having people on the show, so guests on the show. So next year it's never any guarantee that it will happen, but I am
reached out. And if you have any particular like other online content creators who may or may not have OnlyFans that you'd like us to talk to,
shoot scenes with them.
Please give us a suggestion. We've got a couple of suggestions that we're fielding and like reached out to some other people, but obviously more suggestions the better. And I guess
if you could show up to their houses and violently demand that they come on the show, then
and the basic idea is like, are they investigating something interesting? I don't know, like if there's somebody who's obsessed with Buddhist theology who's making videos about it, maybe we should talk to them. Or if they're funny. So if they're like a comedian or something.
We're going to have modern philosopher Joe Rogan on.
He'd be lucky to get on our show. We have high standards here at the Book Club from Hell. Yeah. Like he'll have to take that up with our agent.
I'm our agent. All right. I don't have any more to say. Thanks for listening.
Oh, Merry Christmas.
Buy my book. Buy Tower for Christmas. Merry Christmas.
Happy
Buy
Hanukkah.
my book.
Anything else you might be celebrating, fucking have a great time.
Celebrate it with a copy of Tower.
And help your friends and family also celebrate it with copies of Tower by Jack BC.